Siren had imagined this moment for 3 years. She had pictured the golden lantern light falling across the Greythal, the scent of pine resin and fresh heather drifting through the open windows, the low, reverent hum of her pack gathered to witness the bonding declaration. She had imagined Halion Voss standing at the dais with his hand extended toward her, his dark eyes warm, his voice steady as he spoke her name. She had never once imagined him reaching for her sister instead. The name left his mouth like it was nothing, like it cost him nothing. Viela Ashvena. 2 words. Ordinary, simple, devastating. The Greythal erupted in murmurs, but Siren barely heard them. She stood in the 3rd row, dressed in the deep green gown she had saved 4 months of wages to afford, her hair pinned with the bone comb that had belonged to her mother, and she felt every set of eyes in the room slide toward her before quickly, mercifully. Nobody wanted to watch a woman learn. She had been passed over. Viela stepped forward from the front row. Of course she was in the front row. She was always in the front row. Tall, luminous, her auburn hair catching the lantern light like something out of a painting. She moved toward the dais with the effortless grace of a woman who had never once doubted that the world would make room for her. And she placed her hand in Halion's, and she smiled. Siren's chest caved in, not visibly. She did not stumble, did not gasp, did not make a single sound. She had spent 23 years learning how to be invisible, and that skill saved her now. She stood perfectly still while the pack erupted in applause, while her father beamed from his seat at the elders' table, while Viela's friends clasped each other's arms in delight that was only half surprised, because of course Viela. Of course, Siren's fingernails bit into her palms. The bone comb in her hair suddenly felt ridiculous. A dead woman's keepsake worn by a woman nobody chose. She needed to leave. She needed to walk calmly and quietly toward the side corridor and disappear before anyone looked at her with pity, because pity would break her, and she refused to break in public. Not here. Not tonight. She turned, and the doors of the Greythal blew open. Not opened. Not pushed. The heavy oak doors, each one thick as a man's torso and reinforced with iron bands, slammed inward with enough force to crack the stone archway on both sides. Wind poured through, sharp and cold, and carrying a scent that hit Siren like a fist to the chest. Pine, smoke, something wild and ancient and utterly terrifyingly unfamiliar. Every wolf in the room dropped, not voluntarily, not a conscious choice. Every single shifter, in the Greythal, Halion included, fell to their knees, like the ground had been pulled out from beneath them. The dominance that poured through the open doors was suffocating, a pressure so immense that Siren's vision blurred and her legs buckled. She caught herself on the edge of a bench, gasping. A man stood in the doorway. He was tall in a way that made the proportions of the hall feel wrong, broad-shouldered and dark-haired, dressed in a long black coat that was road-worn and flecked with rain. His face was hard, angular, built from sharp planes and deep shadows, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky just before a storm. Pale, piercing, devastating. He surveyed the room with the casual, unhurried attention of someone who had walked into far more dangerous places than this, and walked out again without a scratch. Then his gaze found Siren. The world stopped. The sound, the murmuring, the wind, the creak of the ruined doors, all of it vanished. Siren's heartbeat slammed once against her ribs, so hard it hurt, and then everything inside her rearranged itself. She felt it like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed, a gravity, deep and primal and absolute, starting in her chest and radiating outward through every nerve. Her wolf, quiet her entire life, dormant to the point where the pack healers had privately wondered if it was stunted, surged forward with a force that stole her breath. It pressed against the inside of her skin, desperate, reaching toward the stranger in the doorway with a need so fierce it bordered on pain. Mate. The word erupted through her like wildfire. The stranger's pale eyes widened. Something cracked in his expression, a fracture in that hard, controlled mask, and she saw shock, real, unguarded, visceral shock. He took a step forward. Every wolf in the room was still on their knees. Hallian's face had gone white. Viola stood frozen on the dais, her hand still resting in his, her expression caught between confusion and fear. The stranger did not look at any of them. He looked only at Saren. He took another step, and with each one, the tether in her chest tightened like a rope being drawn taut. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't move. Her wolf was howling inside her, and the bone comb was slipping from her hair, and the green dress she had saved 4 months for suddenly meant nothing, because nothing in her life had ever felt like this. He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that she could see the scar that ran along his jaw, close enough that she could smell rain on his coat and smoke in his hair, close enough to see his chest rising and falling with breasts that were not as controlled as the rest of him. "Who are you?" Saren whispered. He didn't answer. His gaze traveled over her face like he was memorizing it, cataloging every detail with an intensity that made her skin burn. His throat worked as he swallowed. Behind them, someone was whispering. Saren heard the words Alpha King and Blackridge, and, "What is he doing here?" tumble through the crowd in urgent, frightened ripples. Alpha King. The stranger standing 3 feet from her, looking at her like she was the only solid thing in a world made of smoke, was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. And her wolf was screaming his name. 3 hours earlier, Saren had been kneeling in the dirt behind the healer's cottage, pulling stubborn roots from soil that didn't want to let them go. The afternoon sun sat low and golden over Thornfield, throwing long shadows across the herb garden and warming the back of her neck as she worked. Her hands were stained brown and green at the knuckles. Soil had worked its way beneath her fingernails and into the creases of her palms, and she didn't mind. She never minded. The earth was honest. You put work into it, and it gave you something back. That was more than most things in her life had offered. Malus, the pack's elder healer and the closest thing Saren had to a mother, appeared in the cottage doorway with a mug of tea and a look of mild disapproval. "You haven't started getting ready," Malus observed. Saren tugged a stubborn valerian root free and shook the dirt from it. "I have time. You have less time than you think. The ceremony begins at sundown, and you still have soil in your hair." Saren reached up and touched her braid. Malus was right. Small crumbles of earth fell onto her shoulder. "The dress is laid out," Saren offered, like that counted as preparation. Malus sighed, the particular sigh of a woman who had been raising a difficult child for 2 decades and had long since accepted that the child would remain difficult. "Come inside. I'll heat water for the basin." Saren didn't move immediately. She sat back on her heels and looked at the valerian root in her hand. The bonding ceremony. Tonight, Hadian would stand before the entire pack and declare his chosen mate. Everyone knew it would be Saren. Hadian had been courting her quietly for nearly 2 years. Quiet walks along the northern ridge. Conversations that started about pack logistics and drifted into something warmer. A gift of dried wolfsbane, wrapped in cloth, left at the healer's cottage door with no note. Because Hadian was not a man given to romantic gestures, but he knew she used wolfsbane in her tinctures, and the thought behind it had made her chest ache in the best way. Nobody had said the words aloud. Halion had never made a formal declaration, and Saren had never pushed for one because pushing felt presumptuous. But the understanding was there. Quiet, steady, certain. The way most things in Saren's life were never quite spoken aloud but understood. She stood, brushed the dirt from her knees, and went inside to wash. The green dress looked better than she had expected. It was simple, long-sleeved, fitted through the bodice and flowing from the waist. Not extravagant. Saren did not do extravagant. But the color brought out the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, and when Malus pinned her mother's bone comb into her dark hair, the old healer stepped back and nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Your mother would have been proud," Malus said softly. Saren's throat tightened. Her mother had vanished when Saren was 4. No explanation, no trail, no body. One morning she had been there, and by evening she was gone, and Saren's father had never spoken of her again. The bone comb was all that remained. Saren touched it now, running her fingertip along the carved edge. She had no memories of the woman who wore it, only the weight of her absence, a shape cut out of every family moment, every holiday, every morning that should have begun with a mother's voice and didn't. Her father had kept Saren housed and fed, but that was where his involvement ended. His attention, his pride, his warmth, all of it flowed toward Viella, the firstborn, the accomplished one, the daughter who reflected back the version of his family he wanted the world to see. Saren had grown up in the margins of her own household, raised less by her father than by the old healer who had taken pity on the quiet child left to wander the cottage garden alone. "Will Viella be there?" Malus asked, and the question carried weight that had nothing to do with attendance. "She arrived this morning," Saren said carefully. "Father invited her home for the ceremony." Malus hummed in a tone that communicated roughly 14 separate opinions, none of them complimentary. The old healer had never been fond of Viella. Not because Viola was cruel, exactly, but because Viola occupied space the way a bonfire did. She consumed all the air in the room and never noticed the smaller flames guttering in her wake. Viola was 2 years older, 3 inches taller, and possessed of the kind of beauty that made people forget what they were saying mid-sentence. She had left Thornfield at 17 to train with a prestigious pack in the Southern Territories, and had returned periodically in a blaze of stories, accomplishments, and admiring looks. Every return reminded Saren of exactly how much space she didn't take up. It wasn't Viola's fault. That was the worst part. Viola was never intentionally unkind. She simply existed so brightly that everyone around her dimmed by comparison, and she had never once noticed the dimming because she had never needed to look. Saren walked to the Greythal alone. The evening air was warm and scented with pine, and the path wound through a stand of birch trees whose white bark glowed in the fading light. She could hear the gathering before she saw it. Voices, laughter, the low thrum of a drum being tested. The Greythal was the oldest structure in Thornfield, built from dark stone and heavy timber, its roof peaked and its windows tall and narrow. Lantern light spilled from every opening, golden and inviting. Saren paused at the entrance, took a breath, let herself imagine, one final time, the moment Hadion would say her name. She walked inside. The hall was full. Nearly every member of the Thornfield pack was present, seated on long wooden benches or standing along the walls. The air was thick with body heat and expectation. Saren found a spot in the 3rd row, close enough to see the dais, but far enough back that she didn't feel exposed. Viella was in the front row. Of course she was. She wore ivory, a flowing gown that caught the lantern light and turned her auburn hair to copper. Saren looked down at her own green dress and felt something small and sharp lodge between her ribs. Hadion stood at the dais, tall and composed, his dark hair swept back from his forehead. He wore the formal gray of the Voss line, and his expression carried the sober gravity of a man about to make the most important decision of his life. His eyes swept the hall. They passed over Saren. They didn't stop. A cold thread of doubt wound through her stomach, but she pushed it down. He was nervous. He was performing for the pack. He would look at her when it mattered. Hadion spoke. He talked about duty and legacy and the future of Thornfield, and his voice was strong and clear, and Saren listened to every word and waited for her name. "I have chosen my mate," Hadion said, and Saren's heart climbed into her throat. "A woman of strength, grace, and distinction, a woman who will stand beside me and lead this pack into its next chapter." Viella Ashvane. The silence that followed lasted less than a heartbeat, but inside that heartbeat, Saren's entire world restructured itself. Every quiet walk, every conversation that drifted warm, Every gift left at the door without a note. All of it recontextualized in an instant into something she had imagined, projected, invented out of loneliness and hope and the desperate need to matter to someone. Hadn't stumbled over the name or shown a flicker of regret. He had said Viola's name the way someone states an obvious fact, and the hall had erupted in applause, and Viola had stepped forward glowing, and Saren stood very still in the third row and let the ground dissolve beneath her feet. She turned to leave, and the doors exploded inward. The chaos that followed the stranger's arrival lasted less than 5 minutes, but to Saren, trapped in the eye of it, it felt like it stretched for hours. Every wolf in the Greythal was on their knees, not by choice. The dominance radiating from the man in the doorway was a force of nature, a pressure wave that flattened resistance the way a gale flattens grass. Saren's own knees had buckled, but she had caught herself on the bench and stayed half upright, her hand white-knuckled on the wood, her wolf thrashing inside her with a ferocity she had never experienced. The stranger stood 3 feet away, his pale eyes locked on hers, and the connection between them was a living thing. It vibrated in her chest, hummed along her bones, made her skin feel too tight for her body. Then Hadian found his feet. It took him visible effort. His legs shook as he rose, sweat beading on his forehead, his jaw clenched with the strain of pushing back against the dominance that saturated the room. He stepped in front of Viola instinctively, shielding her, and his voice came out rough and strained. "You're in Thornfield territory. Identify yourself." The stranger's gaze didn't leave Saren's face for another full second. Then, slowly, deliberately, he looked at Hadian. "Theron Blackridge," he said. His voice was low and quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't need volume because it carried authority the way a river carries weight. "Alpha of the Northern Territories, I was passing through your lands. I didn't intend to interrupt." But his eyes cut back to Saren as he said it, and the contradiction was so obvious that several people in the crowd exchanged uneasy glances. Halion's expression tightened. Every wolf in the region knew the name Blackridge. The Northern Territories were vast, brutal, and ruled by an alpha, whose reputation made warlords look diplomatic. Theron Blackridge had united 6 warring territories under a single banner in less than 3 years. The stories about how he'd accomplished that varied, but none of them were gentle. "You're welcome in Thornfield," Hadian said. The words clearly costing him, but this is a private ceremony. Theron's gaze moved from Saren to Hadian, to Viola, still half hidden behind her newly declared mate, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something cold and assessing. "My apologies," Theron said, and the word carried no apology whatsoever. "I'll wait outside." He turned and walked back through the ruined doors, his long coat sweeping behind him, and the moment he crossed the threshold, the crushing dominance lifted. Wolves gasped and sagged and grabbed at each other for support. Saren's legs gave out. She dropped onto the bench, her heart hammering so violently she could feel it in her teeth. Her wolf was throwing itself against the walls of her chest, howling, straining toward the doorway through which the stranger had just vanished. The ceremony resumed. Saren didn't hear a word of it. She sat rigid on the bench, her nails carving crescents into her palms, and stared straight ahead while the formal bonding words were spoken, and Halion pressed his lips to Viola's forehead, and the hall erupted in celebration. She had to leave. She had to get out of this room before she screamed, or cried, or did something far worse, like chase after a stranger whose name she had learned 30 seconds ago. Saren slipped from the bench and moved along the wall toward the side corridor. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever noticed when she left a room. She pushed through the narrow door and stumbled into the cool evening air, pressing her back against the stone wall, and dragging in breath after shaking breath. "You felt it too," the voice came from the shadows to her left. Saren flinched so hard, her head struck the wall behind her. Theron Blackridge leaned against the opposite wall, arms crossed, watching her with those unsettling pale eyes. This close, without the overwhelming press of his dominance filling a room. She could see details she had missed. The scar along his jaw, thin and precise, like a blade, had traced it. The dark circles beneath his eyes. The way his hands crossed casually over his chest were not quite steady. "I don't know what you're talking about," Saren managed, which was the most transparent lie she had ever told. His mouth twitched. Not a smile, something sadder. "Your wolf reached for mine," he said in the hall. "I felt it." Saren's breath caught. Her wolf had been dormant her entire life. Sluggish. The pack healers had whispered words like underdeveloped and latent, and once, when they thought she couldn't hear, defective. Her wolf had never reached for anything or anyone. Until tonight. "That doesn't mean anything," she said. But her voice shook, and they both heard it. "It means everything," Theron said quietly. He unfolded his arms and took a step closer. Not aggressive. Careful, almost cautious, like he was approaching something. He was afraid to startle. "Your wolf called to mine, and mine answered. That hasn't happened in a very long time." The way he said it made her stomach tighten. There was weight behind those words, a heaviness that suggested a story she wasn't yet allowed to hear. "I don't even know you," Saren whispered. "No," he agreed. "You don't." Silence fell between them, thick and charged. Inside the Greythal, someone had started playing a fiddle, and laughter drifted through the walls, muffled and distant, belonging to a celebration Saren was no longer part of. "The man at the dais," Theron said. "Your sister," Saren flinched. She hadn't expected the question, and it landed on the wound before she could guard it. "Yes." Theron studied her face. "He's a fool," he said, and the words were flat and factual, carrying no charm, no flattery, nothing performative. He said it the way someone states that water is wet. Saren opened her mouth to reply, but a door banged open further down the corridor, and a man appeared, moving quickly. He was lean, sharp-eyed, with close-cropped red hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being the second most dangerous person in any room. "My lord," the man said, his gaze darting between Theron and Saren. "The local alpha is mobilizing his guard." Theron didn't look away from Saren. "Brennan, this is not a threat." "The local alpha disagrees," Brennan replied tightly. "He has 12 wolves arming themselves and a very bruised ego. We need to leave or explain ourselves, and I'd prefer the option that doesn't involve blood." Theron exhaled through his nose. For a moment he looked impossibly tired, the kind of tired that sleep alone couldn't fix. Then he straightened and glanced at Brennan. "Arrange a meeting with the Thornfield Alpha," he said. "Formal request. Tomorrow morning." Brennan's eyebrows rose. "We're staying?" Theron looked at Saren one last time, and the bond between them flared so intensely that she pressed her hand flat against her sternum to keep from stepping toward him. "We're staying," Theron confirmed quietly. He turned and walked into the darkness, Brennan falling into step beside him, their footsteps fading into the night. Saren stood alone in the corridor, her back against cold stone, her heart hammering, and her wolf, her quiet, dormant, supposedly defective wolf, crying out after him like it had just watched the sun disappear. Inside the Greythal, the celebration roared on. Halion and Valleila's bonding was being toasted and praised and cemented into pack history, and Seren stood outside it all, invisible as ever, except that for the first time in her life, someone had looked at her like she was the only person in the room. She pressed her hands to her face and tried to breathe. A soft knock sounded on the wall beside her. Saren startled and lowered her hands. Malis stood at the corridor's entrance, her weathered face creased with concern. The old healer looked at Saren's expression, at her trembling hands, at the tears that had started tracking silently down her cheeks, and sighed. "Come, child," Malis said gently. "Tell me everything." Saren told her. The rejection, the doors, the stranger, the bond that had detonated through her chest like a thunderclap, the impossible fact that her wolf, dead and silent for 23 years, had surged to life The moment Theron Blackridge walked into the room, Malus listened without interrupting. When Saren finished, the old healer was quiet for a very long time. "Do you know who he is?" Malus asked eventually. "Beyond the name, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories," Saren said. That's what people were whispering. Malus nodded slowly. He united six packs that had been slaughtering each other for generations, brokered peace, where everyone said peace was impossible. But the cost, child. She paused, her lined face troubled. "There are rumors about the Blackridge Alpha, about something he lost during the Unification Wars. Something no shifter should be able to lose." Saren's blood went cold. "What do you mean?" Malus met her eyes. "They say his wolf is dying." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Saren stared at the old healer, her lips parting, something clicking into place, deep inside her with a certainty she couldn't explain. "And tonight," Saren whispered. "His wolf answered mine." Malus reached out and gripped Saren's hand, her old fingers surprisingly strong. "Be careful," the healer said. "Whatever this is, it's bigger than a bonding ceremony. Bigger than Halion Voss and your sister and everything that happened tonight." She paused, her dark eyes searching Saren's face. "And something tells me it's bigger than either of you. Understand?" Saren lay awake that night in her narrow bed in the healer's cottage, staring at the ceiling, her wolf restless and pacing beneath her skin. She could feel him out there, somewhere in the darkness. She could feel the tether like a rope tied around her ribs, drawing her north toward wherever he was sleeping. If he was sleeping at all. The formal meeting took place the following morning in Thornfield's council lodge, a squat building with low ceilings and a perpetual smell of damp wood. Saren was not invited. She heard about it afterward from Malus, who had heard it from the kitchen's staff, who had heard it from a guard standing outside the door. Theron Blackridge had requested permission to remain in Thornfield territory for a fortnight. He had framed it as a diplomatic courtesy, an opportunity to strengthen ties between the Northern Territories and the smaller Southern packs. Halion had agreed, though the guard reported his jaw had been clenched so tightly throughout the conversation that the sound of his teeth grinding was audible from the corridor. Nobody mentioned the bonding ceremony. Nobody mentioned the doors, and nobody, as far as Saren could tell, mentioned her. She spent the morning in the herb garden, yanking weeds with more force than the task required. Her wolf paced restlessly beneath her skin, pressing forward every few minutes like it was testing the boundaries of her body, looking for a way out. She had never felt anything like it. For 23 years, her wolf had been a dim, quiet presence, barely there, like a candle flame behind frosted glass. Now it burned. Malus appeared at noon with bread and cheese and a pointed observation. "You've pulled up the chamomile along with the thistle." Saren looked down at the pile of uprooted plants in her lap. The old healer was right. An entire row of perfectly good chamomile lay shredded in her hands. "I'm distracted," Saren admitted. "You're rattled," Malus corrected. "There's a difference. Distracted is forgivable. Rattled destroys chamomile." Saren almost smiled. "He's staying," Malus continued, settling onto the stone bench beside the garden wall. 2 weeks, I'm told. I heard." "And how do you feel about that?" Saren considered the question. The honest answer was terrifying and enormous, and entirely too complicated for a conversation over bread and cheese. "I don't know what I feel," she said instead. "Liar," Malus replied pleasantly, and handed her the bread. 3 days passed before Saren saw Theron again. She was crossing the square at dusk, carrying a basket of dried yarrow back from the drying shed, when she spotted him standing near the well. He was alone, which surprised her. No Brennan. No guards. Just the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, standing by a well in a small town square, looking like he had no idea what to do with himself. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. The bond ignited instantly, a flare of heat in her chest that made her stumble. She caught herself, tightened her grip on the basket, and considered turning around, walking away, pretending she hadn't noticed him. She walked toward him instead. "You're alone," she said, because it was the least dangerous observation she could make. "Brennan is dining with your Pax border guards," Theron replied. "He's better at diplomacy than I am." "That seems like a low bar," Saren said, before she could stop herself. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. A slight lift at the corner of his mouth. A softening around his eyes that lasted barely a second before the mask slid back into place. "It is," he agreed. Silence stretched between them. The evening air was cool and carried the smell of wood smoke from the cook fires. Somewhere nearby, children were laughing. "I should go," Saren said, not moving. "You should," Theron agreed. Also, not moving. More silence. Saren's wolf pressed forward eagerly, and she pushed it back. "Your wolf," Theron said, as though he could feel it. "It's different now. Stronger." Saren's grip tightened on the basket. "How do you know that?" "Because mine reacts to it." He looked away, and she saw the tension in his jaw. "It hasn't reacted to anything in a very long time." The admission felt enormous. He had offered it without ceremony, without preamble, just laid it at her feet like something he didn't know what else to do with. "Malus told me about the rumors," Saren said carefully. "About your wolf." His expression shuddered immediately. The softness vanished, replaced by something hard and guarded. "Malus should be more cautious with what she shares," he said. "She's protective of me. Then she and I have that in common." The words left his mouth and he seemed startled by them. He looked away sharply, like he'd revealed more than he intended. Saren didn't press. She had spent a lifetime reading silences, and his was screaming for space. So she gave it to him. She shifted the basket on her hip and said, "I'm sorting yarrow tonight. It's tedious and dull. If you're struggling to sleep, tedious and dull might help." She walked away before he could respond. 2 hours later, a knock sounded on the healer's cottage door. Malus opened it, looked at the towering figure on the doorstep and turned to Seren with an expression that communicated roughly, "You invited the Alpha King to sort herbs?" Saren shrugged, helplessly. The evening that followed was the strangest of Saren's life. Theron Blackridge, conqueror of 6 territories, sat at Malus's workbench with his enormous hands carefully separating yarrow stems from leaves while Saren explained the difference between the flat-topped clusters and the ones that had gone to seed. He was terrible at it. His fingers were too large for the delicate work, and he kept crushing the flower heads instead of pinching them free. After the third mangled cluster, Saren reached over and repositioned his grip. "Gentle," she said. "You're not strangling a man. You're holding a flower. I'm better at the strangling," he muttered. Saren laughed. It burst out of her before she could catch it, bright and genuine, and Theron looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Surprise, maybe, or something hungrier. Malus, who had been watching from her chair by the fire with the sharp attention of a hawk, stood quietly and left the room. They sorted yarrow for another hour. Saren talked, filling the silence, because silence with him felt too charged, too dangerous. She told him about the chamomile she'd destroyed that morning. About the apprentice years ago who had mixed up dried nettles with dried mint and sent a visiting elder into a sneezing fit that lasted 2 days. About the time she'd accidentally brewed a tincture so potent that the guardsman who drank it slept for 36 hours and woke up convinced he'd been dead. Theron listened. He didn't laugh, but his eyes changed. The coldness retreated. The hard lines around his mouth eased. At some point, his hands stopped mangling the yarrow and started handling it almost carefully. "You're better at this than you think," Saren told him, nodding at the neat pile of separated stems in front of him. "Don't patronize me," he said, but there was no edge to it. "I can see the pile I ruined. That pile will go into compost, which will feed the garden, which will grow more yarrow. Nothing is wasted." He looked at her for a long moment. "You believe that?" he said. "Not a question." "I do." Another silence, but this one felt different, warmer, less like a wall, and more like a door left slightly open. "Thank you," Theron said quietly, standing. "For the yarrow, It was just sorting. It wasn't, he said, and the weight in his voice told her everything. His words didn't, he left. Malus reappeared within seconds as though she'd been listening from the next room, which she absolutely had. His wolf, the old healer said, settling back into her chair. When he was sitting here, when you were talking, I felt it stir. Saren's heart skipped. You felt it? Malus nodded slowly, her expression grave. It responded to your voice the way a dying fire responds to kindling. Faint, but there. She paused. Whatever is killing his wolf child, you slow it down. The visits continued. Not every night, but every 2 or 3 evenings, Theron appeared at the healer's cottage door, and Saren found something for them to do. Sorting herbs, labeling tincture bottles. Once, disastrously, grinding dried rosemary in the stone mortar, which ended with rosemary dust coating every surface in the room, and Theron looking so genuinely dismayed at the mess that Saren had to sit down because she was laughing too hard to stand. He never left, but the almost smile appeared more frequently, and each time it lasted a fraction longer than the time before. He began asking questions. Small ones at first. What does feverfew treat? Why do you dry the lavender upside down? Then, larger ones. How long have you lived in Thornfield? Where is your mother? Saren answered honestly. Her mother had vanished when she was small. Her father was alive, but had always looked through her toward Viola, the favored daughter, the accomplished one. Malus had raised her, had given her a purpose, had taught her to heal when no one else had bothered to teach her anything at all. Theron listened to that last part with an expression that looked almost angry, though the anger didn't seem directed at her. You're not unremarkable, he said. You've known me a week, Saren replied. I've known you long enough. The words settled over her like a warm cloth, and her wolf curled toward him, with a trust that terrified her. By the end of the first week, Saren was running out of excuses. She could rationalize the herb sorting. She could justify the tincture labeling as educational for a visiting dignitary with an interest in pack medicine. She could even defend the rosemary incident as an honest accident between 2 people performing a routine task. She could not rationalize the way her heartbeat changed when she heard his knock. She could not justify the way she'd started choosing which dress to wear based on what he might notice, then hating herself for the vanity of it. She could not defend the fact that she fell asleep each night reaching for the bond in her chest, following it like a thread through the dark to wherever he was, and drawing comfort from the knowledge that he was close. Malus noticed. Malus noticed everything. You're wearing your hair differently, the old healer observed one morning. Saren touched the loose waves she'd left down instead of braiding. It's just easier. It's pretty, Malus corrected. And you've never once in your life prioritized pretty over practical. Saren said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't condemn her. She ran into Vela that afternoon. It happened in the square, near the baker's stall. Viola appeared on Halion's arm, radiant and laughing. Her auburn hair catching the sunlight, she spotted Saren and waved with genuine warmth, because that was the cruelest thing about Viola. She was never unkind. Siren, Viola called out, pulling away from Halion to embrace her. I feel like I haven't seen you since the ceremony. Are you well? Saren stood rigid in her sister's arms, acutely aware of Halion's eyes on her, flat and unreadable. He had never once acknowledged what had existed between them. Perhaps nothing had. Perhaps she'd imagined the whole thing. I'm fine, Saren said, pulling back with a smile that felt carved from stone. We must have dinner together soon, Viola insisted. I want to hear everything about the work you're doing with Malus. Father says you've become quite skilled. Father says. As though her father had ever once set foot in the healer's cottage to see her work for himself. That would be lovely, Saren managed. Hadian nodded at her, a perfunctory acknowledgement, the kind you give a servant, you recognize, but cannot quite place. Then he and Vela walked on, and Saren stood in the square and felt the familiar ache of being looked through settle back into her bones, like an old injury that never fully healed. That night, when Theron arrived at the cottage, she was quieter than usual. On the 8th night, Theron arrived looking worse than she'd ever seen him. The circles beneath his eyes were deep and bruised. His skin had a grayish cast that made him look hollowed out. His hands, when he reached for the chair, trembled visibly. "When did you last sleep?" Saren asked, alarmed. "Define sleep." Unconscious, eyes closed, body resting. He considered this. 4 days. Perhaps 5. Saren stared at him. 5 days. That's not possible. "My wolf keeps me alive longer than it should," he said, and the flatness in his voice suggested this was not a gift. Malus appeared from the back room, took one look at him, and pointed at the cot in the corner. "Lie down." "I'm fine," Theron said. "You'll be dead within a month at this rate," Malus replied, with the serene bluntness of a woman who had been telling stubborn wolves the truth for 40 years. "Lie down." Something about Malus's tone, or perhaps the simple exhaustion of fighting, broke through his resistance. Theron crossed to the cot and lowered himself onto it, his large frame making the narrow bed look absurd. His boots hung off the end. His shoulders barely fit between the wooden rails. He lay rigid, staring at the ceiling, every muscle locked. "You need to relax," Saren said, pulling up a stool beside the cot. "This is relaxed," he said. "This is a plank of wood shaped like a man." His mouth twitched. Saren didn't plan what she did next. She simply started talking, the way she always did when the silence between them grew too heavy. She told him about the seasons in Thornfield, how the first frost always came earlier than anyone expected and caught the late-blooming asters off guard. How the river that ran behind the cottage froze solid in deep winter, and the children used it as a slide. How spring arrived not gradually, but all at once, like the earth had been holding its breath and finally let go. His breathing changed. She noticed it the way a healer notices things, the subtle shift from controlled to involuntary, the loosening of the muscles around his jaw, the way his hands uncurled against the blanket. His eyelids grew heavy, fluttered, fought, lost. He fell asleep. Saren stopped talking. The cottage was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the slow, deep rhythm of his breathing. She sat very still on the stool, beside the cot, and watched the tension drain from his face, watched the hard lines soften into something younger and more vulnerable than she had ever seen. An hour passed, then 2. Malus moved silently through the cottage, banking the fire, tidying the workbench, casting glances at the sleeping king with an expression that shifted between professional fascination and something gentler. "Your voice," Malus whispered eventually, settling into the chair across the room. "It's your voice that does it." I watched his wolf respond. The moment you started talking, it calmed. Saren looked at the old healer. "My voice. Combined with your presence, your scent, whatever it is that connects you two. Your voice is the key that turns the lock." Malus paused. "When you speak, whatever is killing his wolf goes quiet." Saren looked back at Theron. In sleep, the severity was gone. He looked like a man, not a king, not a conqueror, just a man who was very, very tired. Something shifted in her chest, a quiet rearrangement of priorities that she felt rather than decided. She reached out and pulled the blanket higher over his shoulder. Her fingers brushed his collarbone as she drew the wool up. The contact lasted less than a second, but Theron inhaled sharply in his sleep and turned toward her touch, his body curving instinctively in her direction. Saren pulled her hand back, her heart pounding. From across the room, Malus said nothing, but her eyes said everything. After that night, the arrangement shifted. Every evening, Theron came to the cottage. Every evening, Saren talked him to sleep. Sometimes it took 20 minutes. Sometimes an hour. The subjects didn't matter. She told him about patience, about herbs, about the time she'd gotten lost in the woods as a child and followed a red fox through the undergrowth because the creature seemed to know where it was going, and she decidedly did not. She told him things she had never told anyone, About the loneliness of growing up as the invisible sister, about the ache of watching her father look through her toward Viola year after year, about the bone comb and how she sometimes held it at night and talked to a mother she couldn't remember, asking questions that would never be answered. He listened to all of it. And sometimes, in the gray pre-dawn light before he woke, she could have sworn his hand had moved closer to hers on the blanket. On the 12th night, he didn't fall asleep. Siren had been talking for nearly an hour, her voice growing hoarse. When she realized his eyes were still open, he was watching her in the low firelight, his gaze unguarded in a way she had never seen. "What?" she asked, self-conscious. "You always do this," he said. "Talk too much? Yes, it's a documented flaw. Give," he said. "You always give. Stories, time, comfort. You give, and I've never once heard you ask for anything." Saren's throat tightened. "I don't need anything. Everyone needs something. Maybe I'm the exception." He sat up slowly, the cot creaking beneath his weight. The firelight carved shadows across his face, deepening the hollows, catching the pale gleam of his eyes. He was close, closer than he'd ever been while awake. "You are exceptional," he said, his voice rough. "But you're not the exception." Saren couldn't breathe. The bond between them was a physical ache pressing against her ribs from the inside, and her wolf was straining toward him with a need so fierce it frightened her. "Theron," she whispered, and the use of his name, no title, no formality, hung between them like a confession. His hand rose slowly. She watched it move through the firelight, watched his fingers hover beside her face, trembling, almost imperceptibly. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and the brush of his fingertips against her skin sent a current through her body that left her shaking. He pulled his hand back like he'd been burned. "I should go," he said, and his voice was wrecked. He left. Saren sat on the stool beside the empty cot and pressed her fingers to the place on her temple where his hand had been. The skin was still warm. Her wolf was making a thin, desperate sound that echoed through her like grief. Malus found her like that 20 minutes later, still sitting, still touching her own face, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "He's going to leave," Saren said, her voice barely audible. "His 2 weeks are almost up, and he's going to leave, and I'm going to feel like this forever." Malus sat beside her and took her hand. "Or," the old healer said, "you could tell him the truth." Saren shook her head. "I'm nobody, Malus. I'm the invisible sister of the woman the local alpha chose. What could I possibly offer a king?" "You offer him sleep," Malus said simply. "You offer him peace. And from what I've seen, those are the 2 things no one else in the world has been able to give him." On the 13th night, Theron did not come to the cottage. Siren waited until the fire burned low, until the candle on the workbench had guttered into a pool of wax, until the darkness outside the window was complete and heavy. She waited until Malus gently suggested she go to bed, and then she waited another hour after that, sitting on the stool beside the empty cot, listening for a knock that never came. He didn't come the next night either. Or the night after that. On the 3rd day, Saren crossed the square at mid-morning and saw Brennan sitting outside the guest quarters, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate strokes. "Where is he?" Saren asked without preamble. Brennan looked up. His expression was careful, measured, the face of a man who was accustomed to delivering uncomfortable information. "The Alpha King is indisposed." "Indisposed? How?" "That's not information I'm authorized to share." Saren planted herself in front of him. "Is he sleeping?" Brennan's hand paused on the blade. The silence that followed was answer enough. "How bad is it?" Saren pressed. The Beta studied her for a long moment. Then he set the blade down and leaned forward, lowering his voice. "He hasn't slept since the night he last came to your cottage. 3 days now, maybe 4. He won't tell me." He paused. "He's ordered me not to let you in." The words hit her like a slap. "He ordered you to keep me away. He believes proximity to him is dangerous for you, that whatever connection exists between you, is drawing something toward you that he doesn't want you exposed to. Brennan's jaw tightened. He's trying to protect you. By killing himself? Brennan said nothing, which was its own form of agreement. Saren's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Let me in. I can't, Brennan. He gave a direct order. And I'm telling you that if he doesn't sleep soon, it won't matter what orders he gave because he won't be alive to enforce them. Something cracked in Brennan's composure. A flicker of fear, quickly suppressed, that told her she was closer to the truth than either of them wanted. I'll talk to him, Brennan said quietly, but I can't promise anything. Saren left the square feeling like the ground was tilting beneath her feet. Her wolf was frantic, tearing at her insides, straining toward the guest quarters, with a desperation that made her physically nauseated. She could feel him through the bond, feel his exhaustion radiating like heat from a forge. Something was wrong, something beyond sleep deprivation, beyond stubbornness, beyond a man's misguided attempt to shield her from harm. That evening, she went to Malus. I need to know everything, Saren said, about dying wolves, about what happens to a shifter when their wolf begins to fail. Malus set down the pestle she'd been using and regarded Saren with the grave assessing look she reserved for serious diagnoses. It's not common, the old healer began. A wolf is not separate from the shifter. It's the other half of the same soul. When the wolf begins to die, the soul tears. Think of it as a cloth being pulled apart at the seam. She sat down slowly, and the shifter becomes unable to rest because the dying wolf fights to stay awake, fights to stay alive. Sleep is surrender, and a dying wolf cannot surrender. Saren felt cold, spreading through her limbs. What causes it? Malus hesitated. Trauma, grief, guilt so profound that the wolf turns it inward. The wolf absorbs the damage the human mind cannot process, and eventually the weight of it becomes lethal. How long does he have? Malus met her eyes. Months, perhaps less. Saren's knees went weak. She gripped the edge of the workbench. My voice calms his wolf. My presence helps it rest. If I'm the thing that slows this down, why won't he let me help? Because he knows something you don't, Malus said gently. About what happens if the bond between you completes, and then he dies. The room went very still. What happens? Saren whispered. If a bonded mate dies, the surviving mate follows, not always immediately, sometimes within days, sometimes weeks. But a completed bond ties two lives together, and when one thread is cut, Malus trailed off. I die too, Saren finished, her voice hollow. He knows this, Malus confirmed. That's why he's staying away. He doesn't want the bond to complete because he believes he's already dying and he won't take you with him. Saren sank onto the stool. The fire crackled. The herbs on the drying rack swayed gently in the warm air. Everything in the cottage was ordinary and familiar and safe, and the man she was falling in love with was across the square, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat, refusing to let her save him, because saving him might kill her. There has to be a way, Saren said, a way to heal his wolf without completing the bond. Malus was quiet for a very long time. There might be, the old healer said finally. But I need to know more about what damaged his wolf in the first place, the trauma that caused this, the specific wound. Without that, I'm treating symptoms. She looked at Saren. He won't tell me. He barely tolerates being in the same room as another healer. He'll tell me, Saren said. You're very confident for a woman he's currently refusing to see. He's refusing to see me because he cares about what happens to me, Saren said, and the realization bloomed through her chest with a warmth that was equal parts joy and anguish. That's not a wall, that's a door. Malus gave her a look that was half admiration and half concern. And what are you going to do? Saren stood. Something stupid, probably. She went to the guest quarters at midnight. The guard outside the door was a young wolf from Thornfield's border patrol, barely old enough to grow a beard, and he looked at Saren with the panicked expression of a man caught between two terrifying authorities. The Alpha King gave orders, the guard stammered. I'm not here for the Alpha King, Saren said calmly. I'm here for Brennan. Healer's visit. His shoulder has been bothering him. It was a lie, a blatant, paper-thin lie. Saren knew he knew it. But the alternative was physically blocking the path of a woman whose eyes were blazing with a determination that bordered on frightening, and the young guard chose survival. He stepped aside. Saren walked through the door and down the short corridor to the main room. Brennan was sitting by the fire, and he looked up at her with an expression that said he'd expected this. His shoulder? Brennan asked dryly. How is he? Saren asked, ignoring the question. Brennan glanced toward the closed door at the far end of the room. He hasn't come out since yesterday morning. I hear him pacing. He won't eat. He won't talk. Saren crossed to the door and knocked. Silence. She knocked again. Theron, it's me. More silence. Then, from behind the door, a voice so rough and ravaged it barely sounded human. Go away, Saren. The use of her name. Not a title, not a dismissal, but her name spoken like something precious and breakable, nearly undid her. I'm not leaving, she said. I told Brennan to keep you out. Yes, he did a wonderful job. I'm very much outside right now. This conversation is definitely happening through a wall. A sound from behind the door. That might have been a laugh, or might have been a groan. You shouldn't be here. And you shouldn't be starving yourself in a room alone, because you're afraid of what might happen if you let someone care about you. Her voice cracked. Open the door, please. The silence stretched so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then she heard the bolt slide back. The door opened. Saren gasped. He looked like death. The word was not an exaggeration. His skin was gray, stretched tight over bones that seemed sharper than they had been days ago. The hollows beneath his eyes were nearly black. He stood in the doorway, swaying slightly, one hand braced against the frame, and the sheer wrongness of seeing someone so powerful reduced to this made her eyes burn. But it was his eyes that terrified her most. The pale winter blue that had pierced her across the Graythal was dimmer, clouded, like a light slowly being smothered. Your wolf, Saren breathed. It's worse. Theron's hand tightened on the doorframe. You need to leave. I know about the bond, she said. I know what happens if it completes and you die. I know why you're pushing me away. Something shattered behind his eyes. Then you understand. I understand that you're sacrificing yourself to protect me, and that I didn't ask you to, and I'm not going to let you. Saren, her name came out ragged. If I let you in, if this bond completes and I cannot beat this, you die. You die because of me. I won't carry that, and if you push me away, you die alone in this room within months. Your wolf dies. You die. And I spend the rest of my life knowing I could have helped and didn't, because you made the choice for me. She stepped forward. That's not protection. That's theft. You're stealing my right to choose. He stared at her. His breathing was labored. His hand trembled against the doorframe. Tell me about your wolf, Saren said, softening her voice. Tell me what happened during the Unification Wars. Tell me what wounded you so badly that your own soul is tearing itself apart. Theron's face crumpled. It was the most devastating thing she had ever witnessed. The mask, the control, the carefully maintained armor of a man who had held 6 territories together through sheer force of will, all of it collapsed in a single moment, and what was left was raw and broken and barely standing. I can't, he whispered. You can, Saren said, and she reached for him. The moment her hand touched his face, he shuddered. A full-body tremor that started in his chest and radiated outward, and she felt his wolf beneath his skin, faint and flickering, reaching toward her touch with the desperate weakness of something that had been dying for a very long time. His legs buckled. Saren caught him, which was absurd, given the difference in their size. But she caught him, lowering them both to the floor, his head against her shoulder, her arms around him. And she held on. Tell me, she whispered into his hair, and finally, broken and exhausted, and unable to fight any longer, he did. There were 6 territories, Theron said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. 6 packs that had been at war with each other for 3 generations. Border conflicts, blood feuds, cycles of revenge that had gone on so long nobody remembered what started them. Saren held him on the cold stone floor of the guest quarters, his weight heavy against her, his breathing shallow and uneven. She didn't move. She barely breathed. She let him speak. I inherited the Blackridge pack at 19, when my father was killed in a raid. The pack was the smallest of the 6, weakest. We were losing territory every season, losing people every month. I knew if I didn't end the wars, there wouldn't be a Blackridge pack within the year. His hand found hers in the dim light and gripped it, not gently, desperately, like it was the only solid thing left. So I did what nobody thought was possible. I went to each alpha, one by one, and I offered them peace. Not through strengths, through surrender. I walked into their territories alone and unarmed, and I said, kill me or listen to me. Those are your options. Saren's heart clenched. The recklessness of it. The courage. 3 of them listened. 2 tried to kill me. The 6th. He paused and his voice changed, dropping into something darker and more damaged. The 6th was a pack called the Severin, led by an alpha named Jorith. He was the worst of them. Cruel in ways that went beyond war. Theron's breathing hitched. Saren tightened her arms around him. Jorith had a daughter, a Lady. The name came out tender and fractured, and Saren knew immediately that this was the center of it. This was the wound. She was young, 15. She came to me in secret and told me her father was planning to ambush my delegation during the peace talks. She betrayed her own pack to save mine. Theron's voice was barely audible now. She asked me to protect her. She said her father would kill her if he discovered what she'd done. She asked me to get her out before the ambush. Saren closed her eyes. She could feel what was coming, the way you feel a storm approaching, the drop in pressure, the stillness before the thunder. I told her I would. I told her to meet us at the river crossing at dawn and we would take her with us. I gave her my word. His hand was shaking in hers. We were attacked that night, hours before the planned crossing. Jorith struck early. My camp was scattered. Half my delegation was killed in the first assault. By the time I regrouped and fought through to the river crossing, it was mid-morning. He stopped. The silence was suffocating. She was already there, Theron said. At the river, she'd come at dawn like I told her to. She'd waited for hours. Saren's eyes were burning. Her father found her first. Theron's voice cracked. She didn't survive what he did. He punished her for the betrayal, and she was gone before I ever reached the crossing. Saren pressed her face against his hair. Tears slid down her cheeks and into the dark strands. I was too late. By the time I reached the river, she was gone. I could see where it had happened. I could see he couldn't finish. It wasn't your fault, Serene whispered. I gave her my word. The words came out like torn metal. I told a 15-year-old girl to trust me, and my word got her killed. Jorath killed her, not you. I put her in the position. I made her believe I could protect her. I couldn't. Saren pulled back just enough to look at his face. It was ravaged. Tears tracked through the grime of days without washing, and his eyes were raw and red, and she had never seen anything so terrible or so human in her life. After the river, I killed Jorath, Theron said flatly. I ended the Severin pact. I unified the territories by force because diplomacy had failed, and I had nothing left inside me that believed in mercy. He swallowed. My wolf began to die the day I found the river crossing. It absorbed the guilt I couldn't carry, and it's been dying ever since. Saren cupped his face in both hands. His skin was clammy and hot at the same time. Feverish. Wrong. You saved 5 territories, she said. Thousands of people are alive because of what you did. And 1 girl is dead because of what I didn't do. You didn't kill her. I failed her. His voice was raw, absolute. And I've been failing her every night since. Because I see her, Saren. Every time I close my eyes, I see her at the river, waiting for me. And she looks at me and she asks why I didn't come. Saren was crying openly now. Her tears fell onto his cheeks and mixed with his. That's your guilt, wearing her face. That's your wolf eating itself alive. Because you refused to forgive yourself for being human. I was supposed to be more than human. I was supposed to be her alpha. I was supposed to keep my word. You were 19 years old. You were ambushed. You fought your way through and you came for her and you were too late. And that is a tragedy. But it is not a sin. It is not a debt you owe, with your life. He shook his head, pulling away. Saren gripped his hands and held firm. I know what it feels like to believe you weren't enough. I have spent my entire life believing that if I had been different, better, more, my mother would have stayed. My father would have seen me, Hallion would have chosen me. His eyes found hers, and she saw the shock in them, the recognition. I believed I deserved to be invisible, Saren continued, her voice thick. I believed I was the one who wasn't worth staying for. And that belief nearly ate me alive. She squeezed his hands. But it was a lie. It was always a lie. My mother's leaving was not about my worth. And Alidi's death was not about yours. Something broke open in his face. Not cleanly. Not neatly. It broke the way ice breaks on a river in spring. Violent and messy, and flooding everything. A sound tore from his chest, a howl trapped in a human throat, and he collapsed forward into her arms. She caught him. She held him while he shattered, while years of compressed grief poured out of him in great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. She held him, and she didn't let go. I'm here, she whispered, the words steady even as her own tears fell. I'm here, and I'm not leaving, and you are allowed to put this down. She didn't know how long they stayed on the floor. Minutes, an hour. The fire burned low, and the room grew cold, and she held him through all of it, her arms aching, her back stiff, her heart wide open. When his breathing finally steadied, he pulled back and looked at her. His face was wrecked, swollen and blotched and stripped of every pretense. He looked terrible. He looked like himself. Stay, he said, and the word carried the weight of everything he couldn't articulate. Every wall he was dismantling. Every defense he was laying down. Saren pressed her forehead to his. I'm not going anywhere. She helped him to his feet. He was unsteady, weak in a way that would have been unthinkable 2 weeks ago. She guided him to the bed and sat beside him, her back against the headboard, his head in her lap. She talked. Not about anything important. Not about grief or guilt or dying wolves or dead girls at river crossings. She told him about the way frost patterns on the cottage windows looked like ferns made of light. About the sound the river made in Thornfield when it ran over the flat stones near the bridge. A sound like laughter, if you listened the right way. About the old cat that lived behind the bakery and had once stolen an entire wheel of cheese and dragged it under the porch, where he defended it for 3 days with the ferocity of a creature 10 times his size. His wolf stirred. She felt it, not through her own senses, but through the bond that was building itself, whether they permitted it or not. His wolf moved beneath his skin, and it was not the desperate, dying flicker she had felt before. It was stronger, steadier, like something that had been drowning and finally found footing. Theron's eyes closed. His breathing deepened. His hand, resting against her knee, went slack. He slept. Saren didn't sleep. She sat in the dark with the Alpha King's head in her lap and watched the shadows shift across the ceiling and felt his wolf slowly, tentatively begin to breathe. At some point, the exhaustion caught up with her. Her eyes grew heavy. Her head tipped back against the headboard. She told herself she would rest for just a moment. She woke in the fog. It was different this time. The grayness was not empty. It pulsed with a presence, a thick, malicious awareness that pressed against her from every direction. The air tasted like ash and grief, and the particular bitterness of promises that were never kept. Saren's bare feet sank into ground that was not quite solid, not quite liquid, and the wrongness of it made her stomach lurch. She was not supposed to be here. Every instinct screamed it. But Theron was here. She could feel him through the bond. She followed the tether through the fog, her arms wrapped around herself, her heart hammering. The silence was the worst part. Not true silence. a manufactured absence of sound that felt like something had swallowed every noise and was still hungry. She found him in a clearing. He was standing at the edge of a river, black water, moving slowly, thick as oil. The far bank was invisible, lost in the fog, and on the near bank, sitting with her knees drawn to her chest, was a girl, a lady. She looked exactly as Saren had imagined from Theron's description. Young, small, gentle-faced with dark hair that fell across her shoulders, and eyes that held a sadness too old for 15. Theron stood above her unmoving, his face blank and devastated at the same time. He was watching the girl the way someone watches a wound they know they should stop touching but cannot leave alone. "Theron!" Saren called out. He didn't respond. His gaze stayed fixed on the girl at the river's edge. Saren moved closer. The fog resisted her, thickening around her legs like wet fabric, and each step required effort that felt disproportionate. Something didn't want her here. Something was actively pushing back. "Theron, look at me." Nothing. His wolf was barely a flicker inside him, a guttering candle flame that the fog was systematically smothering. Saren reached him and took his hand. The contact sent a shock through both of them, and the fog recoiled slightly, pulling back like a living thing that had been stung. The girl at the river looked up. "You came too late," Elodie said. Her voice was soft and patient and utterly terrible, because it was not truly her voice. It was Theron's guilt, given a face and a mouth to speak through. "You always come too late." "That's not her," Saren said, squeezing Theron's hand. "You know that's not her. She waited for me," Theron murmured. "She waited, and I didn't come. You came. You fought through an ambush, and you came, and you were too late, and that is the most painful thing I've ever heard." "You came for her." The fog pressed closer. The girl at the river stood, and behind her other shapes began to form. Faces, bodies. The dead of the Unification Wars emerging from the black water, one by one, their eyes fixed on Theron with an accusation that had no end. "You owe us," they murmured, and their voices were his voice. His guilt, his endless self-condemnation, given form and sound. "You owe us your sleep, your peace, your life." "No," Saren said, and her voice rang through the fog with a clarity that surprised even her. "He owes you grief. He owes you remembrance. He does not owe you his destruction." The figures wavered, the fog churned. Saren turned to Theron. His eyes were glazed, unfocused, sinking into the trance she had feared. The fog was pulling him in, feeding on his agreement, growing stronger with every moment he accepted its judgment. She put both hands on his face and forced him to look at her. "Elodie didn't ask you to die for her," Saren said, tears streaming down her face. "She asked you to live. She asked you to protect her, and you couldn't. And that broke your heart. And I am so sorry. But dying here, letting your wolf be consumed by guilt you've turned into a prison, that doesn't honor her. That doesn't save her. It just means her sacrifice, her bravery in coming to you, in betraying her own father to save your people. It means all of that was for nothing." Theron blinked. Something shifted behind his eyes, a crack in the trance. "She was brave," Saren continued, her voice breaking. "She was 15 years old, and she was braver than anyone in this story. And the best way to honor that bravery is to live. To be the king she believed was worth saving." The girl at the river changed. The sadness lifted from her face. The accusation drained from her eyes. What replaced it was something quiet and clear and unbearably young. She smiled. It was small and uncertain and real, in a way that nothing else in the fog had ever been real, and Saren understood with sudden, bone-deep certainty that this was not the guilt. This was not a ghost made of self-punishment. This was something else, a remnant, an echo, a piece of a brave girl who had been trapped in the same prison as the man she'd tried to save. "Let me go," Elodie said, and this time it was her voice, truly her voice. And she was not asking Theron to suffer. She was asking him to stop. Theron's breath caught. His grip on Saren's hand tightened until it was almost painful, and she could feel the war inside him through the bond, the guilt clinging to its throne, fighting to keep its hold, and the part of him that wanted desperately to let go but didn't know how. A sound escaped him, raw and animal, and full of grief. But beneath the grief was something else, something fragile and newborn and terrified of its own existence. Release. Permission. The first thread of forgiveness, thin as spider silk, but strong enough to bear the weight of what came next. "I'm sorry," Theron whispered. "I'm sorry I was late." The girl nodded. She touched the surface of the black water with her fingertips, and where she touched it, the darkness cleared. The water turned silver, then pale, then transparent, and the transparency spread outward in rings, eating the black, dissolving the fog, unraveling the prison. Thread by thread, the dead turned away. One by one they dissolved into light, their faces releasing their accusations, their forms losing their solidity, becoming memory instead of torment. Elodie looked at Saren. "Thank you," she said. Then she was gone, and the river was gone. And the fog was gone, the clearing filled with light, warm and golden, pouring in from every direction like sunrise happening all at once. Saren felt Theron's wolf surge beneath his skin, not flickering, not guttering, but blazing, rising like a fire that had found fuel after years of starving. The bond between them detonated. Saren felt it snap into place with a force that drove the air from her lungs. It wasn't a gentle completion. It was a collision. Two halves of something ancient and enormous slamming together, with the inevitability of gravity. She felt him everywhere, in her chest, her blood, her bones. She felt his grief and his relief, and his staggering, terrified, overwhelming love for her, and she sent her own back through the bond with equal force. Theron pulled her against him so hard, it hurt. His arms locked around her and he'd buried his face in her neck, and he shook and she shook, and the golden light washed over them both. They woke together in the guest quarters, tangled in the sheets, his arms still wrapped around her. Dawn light poured through the window, soft and gray and ordinary and perfect. Theron looked at her. His eyes were clear. The pale, winter blue that had been dimming for days was vivid again, sharp, alive. "The fog," he said. "Gone," Saren replied. His hand came up to touch her face. His fingers traced her cheekbone, her jaw, the corner of her mouth, mapping her features with the reverence of a man who had just been given back his life and was terrified it might be taken again. "Your wolf," Saren said softly. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. "Breathing," he said, and the word cracked with gratitude. Saren smiled through her own tears and leaned forward and kissed him. It was gentle at first, slow. It tasted like salt and relief, and the beginning of something enormous. His hand slid into her hair, and hers gripped the front of his shirt, and the tenderness of it nearly broke her. Then the bond flared, and gentle wasn't enough. He kissed her harder, deeper, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other wrapping around her waist and pulling her against him. She could feel his heartbeat, slamming against his ribs, could feel the hunger and the reverence tangled together in the way he held her, like she was something precious he was also desperate for. "Saren," he murmured against her mouth, and her name in his voice, roughened by sleep and raw with emotion, undid the last of her restraint. She pulled him closer, and he came willingly, his forehead pressed to hers, his hands cradling her face with a care that bordered on worship. He held her like she was the answer to a question he had been afraid to ask for years. And she held him back with everything she had, pouring every ounce of the love she had been too afraid to name into the space between them until there was no space left at all. The bond blazed, golden and overwhelming, connecting them in a way that went deeper than touch, deeper than words, deeper than anything she had ever known. When he finally pulled back, just enough to look at her, his breathing uneven, his eyes full of a wonder she had never seen in them before, she felt something settle in her chest with absolute finality. Mate, Theron said, against her lips. Mate? Saren echoed, and the word felt like coming home. The healing was not instant. Saren had never expected it to be. She was a healer. She knew that wounds didn't close because you wanted them to. They closed because you tended them, day after day, with patience and care and the stubborn refusal to look away. Theron still dreamed of the river sometimes. He still woke in the dark, with his breath caught and his hands gripping the sheets. But when he woke, Saren was there. She would press her palm flat against his chest and murmur to him until his heartbeat steadied. And his wolf, strong now, growing stronger every week, would curl toward her warmth and settle. He slept, truly slept. Deep, full, dreamless nights that restored the color to his skin, and the sharpness to his eyes, and the devastating composure that made entire rooms go quiet when he entered. They returned to the Northern Territories together. Saren left Thornfield with one bag and the bone comb in her hair, and Melis's fierce, tear-streaked blessing ringing in her ears. "Come back and visit," the old healer had commanded, gripping Saren's hands so tightly her knuckles went white. "And send word when there are children." Melis, Saren had protested, blushing furiously. "I'm old. I'm allowed to be direct." The day they left, Saren passed Halion and Vayala in the square. Vayala embraced her warmly, wished her well, and meant every word. Halion watched Saren walk toward the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, watched Theron's face transform the moment he saw her approaching, watched the way his hand found hers with the ease of something that had always been, and for the first time, something flickered across Hadion's face that looked like the beginning of understanding. Not regret, exactly, but the slow, dawning realization that he had been standing in the same room as something extraordinary and had looked right through it. Saren didn't notice. She had spent 23 years trying to be seen by people who would never look. She was done turning around. She was looking at Theron. The Northern Territories were vast and cold and beautiful, and the people there looked at Saren with open curiosity that took months to soften into acceptance. She was nobody's idea of a queen. She was small, and her hands were permanently stained with herb residue, and she talked too much. But she had done what no healer, no general, no wolf in 6 territories had managed. She had given their king peace. "They'll get used to you," Theron told her one evening, pulling her against his chest as they stood on the balcony of the Blackridge Hold, watching snow fall over the mountains. "And if they don't, then they can take it up with their king," he said, his mouth against her hair, "who happens to be hopelessly, irreversibly devoted to his mate." Saren smiled. She leaned back into his warmth and watched the snow, and felt his heartbeat steady against her spine, and thought about brave girls who are finally allowed to rest, and rivers that turn from black to silver, and the strange, stubborn miracle of being found by someone who was never looking for you. Theron's arms tightened around her. They stood together in the falling snow and breathed.